Before I say what I'm about to say, I feel it necessary to point out that when I direct a dismissive expletive at a group of people or a political movement, I'm addressing that group, that movement, what have you, in a general sense. I don't mean to dismiss every single person who ever may have been a part of that group or identified with that movement, nor do I mean to reject every single idea or argument or concept or proposition that may have been proposed by people within that group or from within that movement. I'm talking about more just the general character of the group. Just the log line, if you will, to employ some screenwriting parlance. And I want you to keep that in mind as you watch this video, and in particular in the next few seconds as I say, fuck the men's rights movement! I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes and just sort of generally expand or reiterate some of my previously expressed thoughts about the men's rights movement, and I'm also going to be responding to some points brought up by IntegralMath, aka Justicar, in his response video that seems to have gone over really well among the men's rights activists who are commenting on my 5 Stupid Things About the Men's Rights Movement video. And I finally got a chance to watch it the other day, and I'm going to talk about that and address some of the specific things that he brought up in his video. And I realize that this isn't everybody's favorite subject, and people who both disagree with me and agree with me on this topic have contacted me either through the comments or through private messages to ask that I just let this be and I don't talk about this, because they hear enough of it from other places, and they associate it with just drama and bullshit and the sorts of things that I generally avoid, and they would hope that I would continue to avoid. And I understand that, and I appreciate that and respect that. And then I've also heard from people who have encouraged me to say more about this, to speak out more against it, lest the men's rights activists' voices become too dominant, particularly within the atheist movement, and I respect that too. Either way, whether you think I should be talking about this more or you wish I would not talk about this anymore, you owe a thank you for this particular video to Richard the Dick Coughlin, because he's the one who suggested it and asked me to do it, and specifically to respond to IntegralMath's video, which I wasn't originally going to do. I was going to just let it be with the 5 Stupid Things video, but I never could say no to Dick. So after approving it as a video response and then having multiple, like at least a dozen, probably more men's rights activists link to it in the comments and demand that I watch it and respond to it, I finally got around a few days ago to sitting down and watching IntegralMath's response video to 5 Stupid Things About the men's rights movement. And I have to say, I was disappointed. I was disappointed watching it because people were telling me that I need to watch it because they say IntegralMath owned you. You have to watch that video because he fucking owned you. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. It's always nice to be the first person to get to do something. And I watched it, and it was incredibly underwhelming. I just found it to be nitpicky and obtuse and just not very impressive at all. But I will address some of the things that he said in that video, in this video, as well as some of the general objections to my men's rights movement position. The first thing that people have said a lot is they've argued with my use of the word misogynist to describe the men's rights movement. They say the men's rights movement is not misogynist because misogyny means to hate women. And men's rights activists don't hate women. The men's rights movement isn't anti-woman, it's pro-men. IntegralMath spent some time in his video on this and also seemed preoccupied with my use of the words essentially and stupid, which I didn't consider either line of discussion to be particularly productive. The worst you can say, I think, about the way I use misogyny is to accuse me of using a soft definition of misogyny, and I can live with that. I do not think that my use of misogyny to describe the men's rights movement is misleading or inaccurate or amounts to an emotional appeal. When you look at the overall character of the men's rights movement, when you look at how men's rights activists conduct themselves and the sorts of things they say in comments of videos like mine, in their subreddit, in their blogs, etc., I do not think it is inaccurate or unfair at all to describe this movement as misogynist, as anti-woman. Not just pro-man, but anti-woman. When you are doing things like comparing the humiliation that men can feel from being fired or being unemployed to the humiliation and pain that women can feel from being raped, I'm sorry, I think that's a misogynist point of view. I think that is insensitive to the point of misogyny. You might not say in your mind, I hate women and that's why I'm saying this, but the practical result is the same. And not only that, but I think the attitude with which males who dissent from the men's rights movement are treated displays a lot of very obvious misogyny. People like me, men who have called out and belittled and mocked and stood against the men's rights movement, are called things like mangina, as though having a vagina is such a fearful prospect that I should be insulted by the suggestion that I have one, or by the childish portmanteau of man and vagina to have that applied. But that should just be a terrible insult to me. Who would want to have a vagina? Do you not see how incredibly misogynistic that is? Or a white knight. Men who oppose the men's rights movement are called white knights because we're swooping in to save the ladies and look good in front of the women so we can get laid. And that's the only reason a man would ever oppose the men's rights movement, because we want to get laid, because the only way we can see any value in women is as sex objects, which to me suggests that perhaps the person accusing someone of being a white knight sees women in that way. And I would say that that attitude is also rather a misogynistic attitude. The question was also asked how I can dismiss the movement as misogynistic and unnecessary, but also acknowledge that it raises some legitimate issues. How can an inherently misogynist movement raise legitimate issues? Isn't that a contradiction? No, stupid, it's not a contradiction. Because I've never said that the men's rights movement is a monolith. And in fact, I actually went out of my way in the video, in the 5 Stupid Things video, to say that I generally consider the men's rights movement to be misogynistic and to be unnecessary and to be a joke. But that doesn't mean that there aren't individual issues raised by it that I find to be legitimate and that I find deserving of a better, more respectable movement to advocate for positive change in them. Recognizing that some people within the men's rights movement raise legitimate issues does not require me to accept the movement as a whole. Just like rejecting the sexist, narcissistic, misogynist, self-pitying, persecution complex bullshit of the majority of the movement, as I perceive it, requires me to dismiss the legitimate issues. It doesn't work that way. Something else that IntegralMath really latched onto in his response video is my use of the phrase historically oppressed to describe women. And that was when I explained that feminism was called feminism because females are the group that have historically been oppressed relative to the males, and they're the ones that were advocating for equal rights to the superior group, which would be men. And he tried to claim that because I described them as historically oppressed, I was acknowledging that they were not oppressed today and that modern feminism only serves to punish modern men for the sins of their forefathers, and that I was somehow okay with this and thought that this is how things should be. This is why I say his video is obtuse and unimpressive. He's spending time arguing with things that I never said, extrapolating points from things that I said that are completely unwarranted, completely inaccurate. I've never said anything like that. I think if you watch the video that he's responding to, and you watch other things, if you've happened to catch me talk about feminism or the men's rights movement and other videos of mine, it's clear that my opinion is that women are still disadvantaged culturally, socially, etc., relative to men. That it is not a past phenomenon. That is the position of the men's rights movement. The men's rights movement says that women are not oppressed, that women are no longer at any sort of level below men, and that feminism does this blah blah blah. That's the men's rights movement position. That's not my position. Objections were also raised to my description of the difference between female and male privilege. I made a joke where I said female privilege means that men will buy you drinks, and male privilege means that you get to run the fucking world. Not only did a lot of people not recognize that that was a joke, but they also recognized, even the people that recognized it as a joke, failed to get why I made the joke in the first place. And it was to illustrate my true opinion about the difference between male privilege and female privilege. Do I think that the extent of female privilege is ladies' night at the bar? No, of course not. IntegralMath mentioned things in his video like the gender disparity in the draft, how only men in the United States are required to register for selective service, and how that would be an example of female privilege. And I agree. I never said that getting dudes to pay for your drinks was the extent of female privilege. What I was doing was comparing female privilege to male privilege. And I think even when you take into account all the various examples you can find of female privilege in our society, when you compare those to the voluminous examples of male privilege, I don't think there is any comparison. I don't see how you can call out women for having female privilege and not have a much larger problem with male privilege. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the selection bias, where men will cry and bitch and moan about how good women have it, and they are completely blind to how good men have it in general relative to women. And again, that phrase "in general" is important, because when we talk about privilege, when we talk about privileged categories of people, privileged classes of society, we're talking in general. We're talking about social norms. A lot of people tried to say that because every single man on the planet is not in a privileged position relative to every single woman, that somehow the idea of male privilege is completely debunked. They tried to say, they asked me questions like, well, how am I privileged as a man? How am I privileged? As though if I couldn't answer that question, it completely disproves the entire notion of male privilege. It's an absurdly simplistic misunderstanding of what the term privilege means. I was also accused of victim blaming. I suggested that perhaps if there is truly a high incidence of female-on-male domestic violence, as many in the men's rights movement claim, maybe the reason why those cases of female-on-male domestic violence are not reported to police more frequently is because of the sort of macho attitudes that the men's rights movement seeks to encourage and defend. That's what I was saying. People tried to say that because I said that I was blaming the victim, or I was somehow suggesting that men who are abused by women have it coming, or that they should be blamed somehow for not reporting it. Like if they didn't report it, then we shouldn't care about it, or it's not a problem. Not what I was saying at all. Again, I really don't see how a fair-minded person could watch what I said or hear what I said and come to that conclusion unless they entered it with an axe to grind already. An axe to grind against feminism or in favor of the men's rights movement. What I said was that the attitudes that are supported, that are defended, that are justified and rationalized by the men's rights movement, the sort of macho attitude that men are supposed to be the tough guys, men are supposed to be the protectors, the breadwinners, the fighters, etc. And if you get your ass kicked by a girl, that means you're less of a man. Or if you feel intimidated by a girl, or if a woman is able to put you in some sort of a vulnerable position, that somehow you're less of a man and you ought to be ashamed of that. Those are the sorts of attitudes that I suggested might be responsible for the incidence of male victimized domestic abuse not being reported, if indeed there are that many. And as I said before, as I said at least twice in that 5 Stupid Things video, and as I've said other times, if men are being abused by their wives, I think we should do something as a society to stop that. I think anyone who is in an abusive relationship should have help, should have counseling, should have an escape route, should have some place to go, someone to call, regardless of that. And I've never said anything that even suggests that I think that men who are abused by women don't count, or that I think that men in same-sex couples who are abused by partners don't count and we shouldn't worry about that. What I have said is, if there are men who are not reporting female abuse on them by a female, maybe it's because of these sexist attitudes, these masculine macho attitudes. And these are the sorts of attitudes that are encouraged by the men's rights movement, that fuel the men's rights movement. And those attitudes are what I was blaming, not the victims. There was another objection raised many, many times, which seemed very odd to me. It was, what about the female men's rights activists? What about girl rights? What about the women who come out against feminism or for the men's rights movement? What about them? What do you say about them? I find that a really stunning play to make from a men's rights activist, considering that men's rights activists are not moved at all by a mangina such as myself opposing their movement. People also have suggested that my objections to the men's rights movement could and should be applied equally to feminism. and they say, why don't you do 5 stupid things about feminism? You know, you did 5 stupid things about the men's rights movement. And if I can think of 5 things that I consider to be funny and informative and entertaining and what have you, interesting, for me to say about feminism, I will absolutely do a 5 stupid things about feminism video. I have no qualms about doing that at all. But here's the difference between the men's rights movement and feminism. I do have a problem with radical feminists. I think that that is counterproductive. But there are some important distinctions to make. First of all, I do not perceive those radical, harshly anti-male voices to be representative of feminism as a whole. I do perceive anti-woman voices to be representative of the greater part of the men's rights movement. And even though I reject their tactics and I reject their tone and I consider them overall to be counterproductive to the goals of the overall feminist movement, I get why radical feminists are so angry. I think underneath the anger and the reactionary stuff, I sympathize with them. I understand why they're so upset. I understand why they are so enraged against patriarchy, against male chauvinism, against male dominance of women in society. I get why they're so upset, because those things are real. And they're not just real for a few women. They're not just real for a small percentage of women. It's categorical. It's widespread. It's at multiple levels of our culture, all over our society, and in fact, well beyond our Western society, all over the world, and much, much worse than we have it in many other parts of the world. I get why they're upset. I don't get, rationally, why men's rights activists are so upset. I don't think that there is a rational basis for a political movement like this. And I've said this before, and people have accused me of being biased or being anti-male or being too pro-feminist or drinking the feminist Kool-Aid or whatever. You can point out to me areas where men have been mistreated in our society, where men have been mistreated by women, where men have suffered because of favoritism shown to women. And I don't deny that. But that doesn't mean that men as a class, as a category of people, are persecuted. Much less persecuted by women. There's a difference between pointing out cases where men have been mistreated, or pointing out areas of our culture where men fall behind women, and describing men as a whole as a persecuted class, or a disempowered class, or an underprivileged class. That is absurd. It's possible to point out areas where Christians are mistreated in our culture because of their Christianity. It's possible to point out areas where straight people are disadvantaged because of their sexuality in our culture. It's possible to point out areas where white people are disadvantaged because of their whiteness in our culture. None of that means that straight people, that white people, that Christians, that men are disadvantaged, underprivileged classes that require political movements to raise them up. It's absolutely absurd. And to compare the overall sufferings of men to the overall sufferings of women in our culture is not only absurd, it's offensive. And yet that is arguably the fundamental claim of the men's rights movement, that women, in the West at least, are not oppressed. And IntegralMath said that openly, without an ounce of shame, without an ounce of embarrassment in his video. Western women are not oppressed. They have the right to vote. They're half the population. If they really are that concerned about these inequalities in society, if they're really that worried about making less money or not being as represented in elected government or being discriminated against by religious institutions, etc., 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 they just must want it that way. because they have the power to change it. They have the right to vote. They have the same rights we have as men. If they really wanted things to be different, why wouldn't they just change things? They have the power. They must just want it this way. And it strikes me that that line of reasoning can be turned just as sharply, if not much more so, on many of the complaints raised by men's rights activists. If men, who are half the population and have the right to vote, are really so upset about being the only sex eligible for the draft, they must just want it that way because they haven't done anything to change it. And in fact, there hasn't even been a military draft in this country since the Vietnam era, which dilutes that men are the ones who go off and die in the wars argument even further, because it's a volunteer force. And why is it so horrible that men are being sent off to die in wars in such greater numbers than women, when it must be what the men want? They're volunteering for the military. Nobody's twisting their arm. Why do we need the men's rights movement to address this issue? It seems like the sort of thing that would just sort itself out, doesn't it? The point is this. If you are going to make the ridiculous claim that women are no longer underprivileged or oppressed or disadvantaged in this culture, you cannot then make the other claim that men are disadvantaged, that men are oppressed or underprivileged to such a degree that they need a men's rights movement to step in and address these grievances and correct these inequalities on a cultural level. You can't make both of those claims and hope to be taken seriously. And when I watch Justicar's video, IntegralMath's video, you can just feel his yearning to be taken seriously. Personally, it's nice if people take me seriously. It's nice if people put some sort of trust or weight in things that I say in these videos. But obviously, being taken seriously doesn't keep me up at night. I make videos with stuffed animals. If you don't take things I say seriously, that's fine. That's your choice. It's no skin off my ass. But you can just see in IntegralMath's video, he just so wants to be taken seriously. It just emanates off of him. It's sad in a way. It's pathetic how seriously he wants people to take him. And you can't take him seriously when he says ridiculous, idiotic bullshit like women aren't oppressed. And then he goes into all these examples of how men are oppressed. Because despite those legal equalities that apparently have wiped out all of the gender inequality issues faced by women in this country, in this culture, in this civilization, despite those, women are still significantly underrepresented in elected government. Women are still significantly underrepresented in top jobs in business. Men overwhelmingly are still the gatekeepers in many of these institutions, in many of these areas of life. Women are still overtly discriminated against in major religious institutions. Too many women, far too many women, are still remaining in abusive relationships with men. And not because they fear having a dish thrown at them, not because they just don't want to bother reporting it to the police, not because they're afraid of what other people will think of them if they report their abuser, but because they genuinely fear for their safety or for the safety of their children. I'm not the one who sneers at that and dismisses it and says, oh, women aren't oppressed. I'm not the one who refuses to call misogyny by its fucking name, Justicar. You pedantic douchebag, that's you. You apologist. You water carrier. You self-satisfied little sophist with your affected air of indignation, righteous indignation, as though I should be embarrassed by the things I've said about the men's rights movement, as though I have somehow belittled the suffering of men in my culture, when in fact it's the men's rights movement and the kind of bullshit attitudes that the men's rights movement defends and enables that has done more harm to suffering people, disadvantaged people of both sexes, than even its warped, distorted, funhouse mirror nightmare version of feminism does. I'm not the one who takes up for that. That's you. I'm not the one defending this movement that discredits itself, that discredits its own causes. Even the just ones, even the ones that aren't anti-feminist fantasies from a bunch of wounded, self-pitying, woman-fearing losers with persecution complexes. That's not me. That's you. You're the one defending that. You're the one enabling it. You're the one propping up the bullshit attitudes that feed it. Now, this is not going to become an anti-men's rights movement channel. This is not going to become a predominantly pro-feminist content channel. But I didn't want to walk away from this issue without responding to what IntegralMath said in his video, and without giving one last little kick to the ribs to the men's rights movement, because I feel that that is what it deserves, and far, far more than that. To those of you, the few of you, and right now off the top of my head I can only think of 2 or 3 people from the comment section of the men's rights movement video that I made previously, who strike me as wanting to be taken seriously and as being earnest and respectful and concerned with what I would consider to be legit issues like men's health, like men who are victims of domestic violence, like the gender inequality and selective service, and the things I mentioned previously as legitimate issues. If you really are concerned about those issues, my advice to you is to stop running to the defense of the men's rights movement, because that movement is your enemy. Because you might want to think that you, the reasonable ones, speak for the movement, but speaking as someone from outside of it, who is looking at it, you don't. You don't. And if I were you, and I really cared, I would find another movement to identify with. I would start my own. Because if you really care about legitimate issues, you cannot continue to associate yourself with something as offensive and that is as much of a joke as the men's rights movement. And to the rest of the men's rights activists, to the rest of the men's rights movement, those of you who might pretend to be interested in those serious, legitimate issues, but are really just mostly interested in bitching about feminism and complaining about how much you've done for women in your life and how little women have done for you, to you guys who have revealed yourself in your tactics and your attitudes and the things you've said and the quality of your arguments and the character of your various statements to be really no different than Ron Paul supporters or 9/11 truthers or Sandy Hook conspiracy theorists. Because you can always tell when you've really kicked a hornet's nest. Anytime you say anything negative about Ron Paul, anytime you say anything negative about the 9/11 truth movement or conspiracy theories or whatever, they always come in droves. They come like moths to the flame to troll your videos. And that is exactly what has happened with the men's rights movement. You can always tell. And you can tell that the men's rights movement overall in general is no different from those other groups. Familiarity has certainly done nothing to improve my opinion of you guys, of you men's rights activists. Overall, I found you to be self-righteous and self-pitying and blindingly self-interested, and I found that you grossly overestimate your own influence, your own power, your own ability to impress and intimidate. And it's for those reasons and all the other reasons that I've mentioned in this video and other videos that despite your crude and often adorable best efforts, you don't intimidate me, and you damn sure don't impress me.